In 1984, a small community nonprofit dedicated to helping homeless families vanished overnight with over $5 million in federal grants. No arrests were made, no suspects were named, and no money was recovered. The case file was quietly sealed, the organization dissolved, and the scandal buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence. For nearly 4 decades, it remained one of the most sophisticated nonprofit frauds in American history, a perfect crime that had left no witnesses, no paper trail, and no hope of resolution. But in early 2023, during a routine computer system upgrade at the Internal Revenue Service, a single automated cross-check between 2 databases triggered an alert that no human had programmed it to find. Hidden within millions of transactions was one anomaly, one thread that had been waiting 39 years to be pulled. What started as a mundane data migration would unravel a conspiracy so methodical, so carefully constructed, that investigators would later call it a masterclass in institutional deception. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The organization in question was called Community Bridge Foundation, a modest nonprofit headquartered in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Sacramento, California. Founded in 1979 by a soft-spoken social worker named Margaret Chen, the foundation had built a reputation for efficiently managing federal housing assistance programs. Chen, a former case manager with the County Social Services Department, had witnessed firsthand the bureaucratic failures that left vulnerable families cycling through temporary shelters and inadequate housing. Her solution was simple, direct, and seemingly effective. Community Bridge operated differently from other nonprofits. Rather than maintaining permanent facilities or staff, the foundation served as a financial intermediary, channeling federal grants directly to families in crisis. Chen's model eliminated overhead costs, reduced administrative delays, and allowed maximum funding to reach those who needed it most. By 1982, the organization was processing over $3 million annually in federal housing grants, with approval ratings from both beneficiaries and government oversight agencies that were consistently outstanding. The foundation's success attracted attention from federal administrators looking for scalable solutions to the nationwide housing crisis. In late 1983, Community Bridge was selected to pilot an expanded program that would distribute emergency housing assistance across multiple states. The federal commitment was substantial, a 4-year contract worth $18 million, with the first installment of $5.2 million scheduled for transfer in January 1984. Chen assembled a small but experienced team to manage the expansion. Her deputy director was Thomas Kellerman, a former auditor with the Department of Housing and Urban Development who had left government service to work in the nonprofit sector. The financial operations were overseen by Linda Santos, a certified public accountant who had previously managed grant compliance for several large charitable organizations. The program coordinator was David Pierce, a young graduate of UC Berkeley's social work program who had volunteered with Community Bridge since its early days. On paper, the team represented exactly the kind of professional competence that federal administrators wanted to see in their grant recipients. Each member had relevant experience, clean background checks, and references that painted them as dedicated public servants committed to addressing one of the nation's most pressing social problems. The foundation's track record supported this impression. Financial audits were consistently clean, program outcomes exceeded targets, and administrative costs remained well below federal guidelines. The first warning sign came not from the foundation's operations, but from an unrelated investigation being conducted by the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. In March 1984, prosecutors were examining a suspected welfare fraud ring when they discovered that several individuals had been using false identities to claim benefits from multiple agencies simultaneously. During the course of that investigation, county investigators noticed that some of the fraudulent claims had been processed through Community Bridge Foundation. The county's inquiry was routine, almost perfunctory. Investigators assumed that Community Bridge had been an unwitting victim of the fraud scheme, providing legitimate services to individuals who had misrepresented their circumstances. A single detective was assigned to interview Foundation staff and review relevant files. The detective, Maria Gonzalez, had been with the county for over a decade and was known for her methodical approach to financial crimes. When Gonzalez arrived at the Community Bridge offices on a Wednesday morning in late March, she found the building empty. The warehouse space that had housed the Foundation's operations was cleared of furniture, files, and equipment. A handwritten note taped to the front door stated that the organization had relocated to new facilities, but provided no forwarding address. Phone calls to the Foundation's listed numbers reached only disconnected lines. Gonzalez's initial assumption was that Community Bridge had simply moved without updating their registration information, a common oversight among small nonprofits. She contacted the California Secretary of State's office to obtain updated contact information, but discovered that the Foundation's corporate registration had been voluntarily dissolved 3 weeks earlier. The dissolution paperwork, filed by Margaret Chen in her capacity as president, indicated that the organization was ceasing operations due to the completion of its federal contract. This explanation seemed plausible until Gonzalez cross-referenced the dissolution date with federal grant records. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Community Bridge was still actively receiving funds as of the day the dissolution was filed. In fact, the Foundation had processed over $1.2 million in payments to beneficiaries during the week, immediately preceding its legal dissolution. The discrepancy prompted Gonzalez to dig deeper. She obtained copies of the Foundation's final financial reports, submitted to both state and federal agencies as part of the dissolution process. The documents indicated that all federal funds had been properly distributed to eligible recipients, with detailed accounting showing payments to hundreds of families across 4 western states. Administrative costs were listed at exactly 7.8% of total expenditures, well within federal guidelines and consistent with the Foundation's historical performance. But when Gonzalez attempted to verify a sample of the payments, she encountered immediate problems. Many of the recipient addresses listed in the final reports corresponded to vacant lots, demolished buildings, or commercial properties. Phone numbers for families who had allegedly received assistance were either disconnected or belonged to individuals who denied any knowledge of Community Bridge Foundation. The scope of the problem became clear when Gonzalez expanded her verification efforts. Of the first 50 recipients she attempted to contact, only 3 could be located, and all 3 denied receiving any assistance from Community Bridge during 1984. 2 of them had indeed worked with the Foundation in previous years, but insisted they had received no recent payments. The third had never heard of the organization at all, despite being listed as having received over $8,000 in rental assistance. Gonzalez forwarded her findings to the FBI's Sacramento field office, which opened a formal investigation in May 1984. Federal agents quickly confirmed that Community Bridge Foundation had been the recipient of $5.2 million in housing assistance funds between January and March of that year. They also confirmed that the vast majority of the payments documented in the Foundation's final reports had never actually reached their intended recipients. The investigation revealed a pattern of systematic deception that had been carefully constructed over a period of months. Beginning in late 1983, someone within the Foundation had been creating fictitious beneficiary files, complete with forged documentation, fabricated case histories, and false contact information. The fraudulent files were mixed seamlessly with legitimate cases, making detection nearly impossible during routine oversight reviews. Federal investigators estimated that approximately $4.7 million of the $5.2 million grant had been diverted through this scheme. The remaining funds had been used for legitimate program expenses and administrative costs, maintaining the foundation's appearance of normal operations even as the fraud was being executed. The sophistication of the operation impressed even experienced financial crimes investigators. The perpetrators had not simply stolen money and disappeared. They had created an elaborate system that could have continued indefinitely, if not for the coincidental county investigation that exposed their activities. Every aspect of the fraud had been designed to withstand scrutiny, from the carefully crafted beneficiary profiles to the precise timing of the foundation's dissolution. The most disturbing aspect of the investigation was not the scale of the theft, but the methodical precision with which it had been executed. As federal agents pieced together the timeline, they discovered that the fraud had been planned with the kind of operational discipline typically associated with intelligence operations rather than common criminal enterprises. Every detail had been anticipated, every contingency prepared for, and every potential point of failure systematically eliminated. The Foundation's bank records revealed the true sophistication of the scheme. Rather than funneling stolen funds into personal accounts, the perpetrators had established a complex network of shell corporations and dummy accounts that made tracing the money nearly impossible with 1984 technology. Funds were transferred through multiple intermediary accounts, each one appearing legitimate on the surface, before ultimately disappearing into what investigators would later describe as a financial black hole. Margaret Chen, the Foundation's founder and public face, had vanished completely. Her apartment was abandoned, her personal bank accounts were closed, and her vehicle was found in a long-term parking lot at San Francisco International Airport. Surveillance footage from the airport showed a woman matching Chen's description boarding a flight to Miami, but the trail went cold there. The name on the ticket belonged to someone who had died 3 years earlier in Oregon. Thomas Kellerman, the deputy director with HUD experience, had disappeared with equal thoroughness. His apartment was cleared out, his utilities were disconnected, and his employment history prior to joining Community Bridge proved to be entirely fabricated. The references he had provided during his hiring process led to disconnected phone numbers and non-existent addresses. Even his professional credentials were false, created through a sophisticated forgery operation that had produced convincing but completely fraudulent documents. Linda Santos, the certified public accountant, had also vanished without a trace. Her CPA license was legitimate, but investigators discovered that her identity had been assumed through a process they would later term identity assumption rather than identity theft. The real Linda Santos had died in a car accident in Nevada in 1981. Someone had taken her credentials, her professional history, and her identity, using them to create a convincing professional background that withstood multiple background checks. David Pierce, the program coordinator, was the only team member whose background proved to be authentic. Investigators found him living under his real name in Portland, Oregon, where he was working as a case manager for a legitimate social services agency. When questioned, Pierce claimed to have no knowledge of any fraudulent activity at Community Bridge. He insisted that he had left the organization in February 1984 due to personal reasons and had not been involved in its final operations. Pierce's account was consistent and detailed. He described Community Bridge as a well-run organization that had genuinely helped thousands of families over its 5-year existence. He spoke positively about Margaret Chen's leadership and expressed shock at learning about the fraud. His financial records showed no unusual deposits or expenditures, and his employment history after leaving Community Bridge was transparent and verifiable. However, federal investigators remained skeptical of Pierce's claims of innocence. The sophistication of the fraud suggested that it required someone with intimate knowledge of the Foundation's operations and federal reporting requirements. Pierce had been responsible for program coordination and client intake, giving him access to exactly the kind of information that would be needed to create convincing, fraudulent files. The investigation into Pierce's role was complicated by the discovery that he had been romantically involved with Margaret Chen during his time at Community Bridge. Several witnesses confirmed that the two had been in a relationship, though Pierce had denied this during his initial interviews. When confronted with evidence of the relationship, Pierce admitted to the romantic involvement, but continued to maintain his innocence regarding the fraud. Federal prosecutors faced a difficult decision. The evidence against Pierce was circumstantial but compelling. His access to sensitive information, his relationship with the primary suspect, and his departure from the organization just weeks before its dissolution all suggested possible involvement. However, there was no direct evidence linking him to the fraudulent activities, and his financial record showed no signs of ill-gotten gains. The case against Pierce was further complicated by the discovery that he had attempted to contact federal investigators several months before the fraud was exposed. Phone records showed that Pierce had called the FBI's Sacramento office in January 1984, apparently trying to report concerns about Community Bridge's operations. However, the agent he had spoken with was involved in a high-priority terrorism investigation at the time and had failed to follow up on Pierce's call. This revelation created a significant problem for the prosecution. If Pierce had indeed tried to report the fraud, it would be difficult to argue that he was a willing participant in the conspiracy. Defense attorneys would likely use the ignored FBI contact as evidence that Pierce had been trying to expose the scheme rather than participate in it. The investigation stalled as agents struggled to build a prosecutable case against any of the suspects. The three primary perpetrators had disappeared completely, leaving no forwarding addresses, no financial trails, and no witnesses who could provide information about their whereabouts. Pierce remained the only available target, but the evidence against him was insufficient to guarantee a conviction. Meanwhile, the stolen money remained missing. Despite extensive efforts by federal investigators and private auditors, none of the diverted funds had been recovered. The shell corporations used to launder the money had been dissolved, their bank accounts closed, and their assets liquidated through a series of transactions that spanned multiple states and jurisdictions. The complexity of the money trail suggested that the perpetrators had received professional assistance from individuals with expertise in financial crimes and money laundering. Federal investigators suspected that the Community Bridge fraud was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger criminal enterprise that specialized in sophisticated non-profit frauds. This theory was supported by the discovery of similar cases in other states. Between 1982 and 1984, at least 6 other non-profit organizations had disappeared with federal grant money under circumstances that bore striking similarities to the Community Bridge case. In each instance, the organization had been well regarded, the staff had impeccable credentials, and the fraud had been discovered only after the perpetrators had vanished. The pattern suggested a coordinated operation involving professional criminals who specialized in infiltrating and exploiting nonprofit organizations. The sophistication of their methods, combined with their ability to assume false identities and create convincing professional backgrounds, indicated that they were part of a larger network with resources and expertise that extended far beyond what any individual criminal could possess. Federal investigators began treating the Community Bridge case as part of a broader investigation into what they termed the nonprofit fraud network. This expanded investigation would eventually span multiple years and involve law enforcement agencies across the country, but in 1984 it was just beginning to take shape. As federal agents expanded their investigation into what they suspected was a coordinated nonprofit fraud network, a disturbing pattern began to emerge from archived case files across the country. The Community Bridge Foundation was not an isolated incident, but rather the most sophisticated example of a criminal enterprise that had been operating with impunity for years. In Phoenix, Arizona, investigators discovered that the Desert Hope Community Center had vanished in late 1983 with $2.8 million in federal education grants. The organization had been founded by a charismatic former teacher named Robert Martinez, who had assembled a team of experienced education professionals to manage literacy programs for disadvantaged adults. Like Community Bridge, Desert Hope had maintained an exemplary reputation right up until its sudden dissolution. The parallels were unmistakable. Martinez had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind an abandoned office and a trail of fraudulent documentation. His deputy director, a woman named Patricia Wells, had also vanished, and subsequent investigation revealed that her professional credentials were entirely fabricated. The organization's financial records showed the same pattern of shell corporations and dummy accounts that had been used to launder the Community Bridge funds. In Detroit, Michigan, the Urban Youth Initiative had disappeared, with $3.4 million in federal job training funds in early 1984, just months after Community Bridge's dissolution. The organization had been founded by a former social worker named Kenneth Thompson, who had recruited a team of experienced professionals to manage vocational training programs for unemployed young adults. Once again, the staff had vanished completely, leaving behind only fraudulent documentation and a complex money laundering scheme. The geographical spread of the cases suggested that the perpetrators were operating on a national scale, moving from state to state to avoid detection. Federal investigators began mapping the locations and timing of the fraudulent organizations, looking for patterns that might reveal the network's operational structure. What they discovered was even more sophisticated than they had initially suspected. The fraudulent nonprofits were not random targets of opportunity, but carefully selected organizations that met specific criteria. Each one operated in a different field: education, housing, job training, health services, making it unlikely that investigators in different jurisdictions would recognize the connections between cases. The timing of the frauds was also carefully orchestrated. The perpetrators would establish legitimate operations for several years, building credibility and trust with federal oversight agencies. Only when they had secured access to substantial grant funding would they execute their theft, disappearing just as federal auditors began their routine compliance reviews. The sophistication of the identity assumption process became clearer as investigators delved deeper into the backgrounds of the vanished staff members. In each case, the perpetrators had assumed the identities of real people who had died in circumstances that made their deaths unlikely to be widely known. They targeted individuals who had died in different states from where they had lived, whose deaths had not been widely reported, and whose professional credentials could be verified through official channels. The process of assuming these identities required access to sensitive government databases and sophisticated forgery capabilities. Federal investigators suspected that the network included individuals with intelligence or law enforcement backgrounds who had the skills and access necessary to create convincing false identities. The money laundering schemes used by the network were equally sophisticated. Rather than simply stealing funds and fleeing, the perpetrators had created elaborate financial structures that made the money nearly impossible to trace. Funds were moved through dozens of intermediary accounts, shell corporations, and offshore banking facilities before disappearing into what investigators described as a financial labyrinth. The scale of the operation became apparent as more cases were identified. By late 1984, federal investigators had connected at least 12 fraudulent nonprofit organizations to the same criminal network. The total amount stolen exceeded $20 million, making it one of the largest nonprofit fraud schemes in American history. Despite the extensive investigation, no arrests were made. The primary perpetrators had vanished so completely that investigators began to suspect they had received professional assistance in disappearing. The false identities they had assumed were abandoned as thoroughly as their real ones had been concealed, leaving no trail for law enforcement to follow. The investigation faced another significant obstacle in the form of bureaucratic resistance from federal agencies. Several departments that had been defrauded by the network were reluctant to cooperate fully with the investigation, fearing that public disclosure of the frauds would damage their reputations and jeopardize future funding for legitimate nonprofit programs. This reluctance to share information hampered investigators' efforts to piece together the full scope of the network's activities. Critical evidence remained locked in agency files, protected by claims of confidentiality and administrative privilege. Without access to complete records, investigators struggled to build comprehensive cases against the perpetrators. The political sensitivity of the cases also complicated prosecution efforts. The fraudulent organizations had targeted some of the federal government's most visible social programs, including housing assistance, job training, and education initiatives. Public disclosure of the frauds would inevitably lead to criticism of the agencies responsible for oversight, potentially undermining support for the programs themselves. Senior federal officials faced a difficult choice between pursuing justice and protecting the integrity of important social programs. The decision was made to pursue the investigation quietly, without public disclosure of the full scope of the frauds. This approach allowed the affected agencies to implement new oversight procedures without attracting unwanted attention, but it also meant that the perpetrators were unlikely to face serious consequences for their crimes. The Community Bridge case was officially closed in March 1985, nearly a year after the fraud was discovered. David Pierce, the only suspect who could be located, was never charged due to insufficient evidence. The case file was sealed and classified, ostensibly to protect ongoing investigations into related cases, but effectively ensuring that the details of the fraud would remain hidden from public scrutiny. The sealed classification would remain in place for decades, preventing journalists, researchers, and even congressional investigators from accessing information about the case. The Community Bridge Foundation became a footnote in federal crime statistics. Its sophisticated fraud reduced to a simple line item in annual reports on nonprofit financial crimes. Margaret Chen, Thomas Kellerman, and Linda Santos were never found. Despite extensive efforts by federal investigators, international law enforcement agencies, and private investigators hired by insurance companies, the three primary perpetrators vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Their false identities were abandoned, their real identities remained unknown, and their current whereabouts became one of the enduring mysteries of American white-collar crime. The stolen money was never recovered. Insurance payouts to the federal government covered only a fraction of the losses, and most of the diverted funds remained missing. Financial investigators estimated that the money had been moved through so many intermediary accounts and shell corporations that tracing it would be virtually impossible even with unlimited resources and time. The sophistication of the Community Bridge fraud set a new standard for nonprofit financial crimes. The perpetrators had demonstrated that with sufficient planning, expertise, and resources, it was possible to steal millions of dollars from federal programs while maintaining the appearance of legitimate charitable work. Their success inspired imitators and forced federal agencies to completely overhaul their oversight procedures for nonprofit grant recipients. New regulations implemented in the wake of the Community Bridge case required more extensive background checks for nonprofit staff members, more frequent financial audits, and more rigorous verification of program outcomes. These measures significantly increased the administrative burden on legitimate nonprofit organizations, but they were deemed necessary to prevent similar frauds in the future. The long-term impact of the case extended far beyond the immediate financial losses. Trust between federal agencies and nonprofit organizations was severely damaged, leading to a more adversarial relationship that persisted for years. Many legitimate nonprofits found themselves subjected to invasive oversight and bureaucratic delays that hampered their ability to serve their communities effectively. The sealed nature of the case file also meant that important lessons about sophisticated financial crimes were not shared with law enforcement agencies or academic researchers who might have benefited from studying the perpetrator's methods. The secrecy that was intended to protect ongoing investigations may have inadvertently made similar crimes more likely by preventing the development of effective countermeasures. For nearly 4 decades, the Community Bridge Foundation remained buried in classified files, its story known only to a handful of federal investigators and agency officials who were bound by secrecy agreements. The sophisticated fraud that had stolen over $5 million from programs designed to help the most vulnerable members of society was effectively erased from public memory, hidden behind layers of bureaucratic classification and administrative convenience. The perpetrators had achieved something remarkable in the annals of American crime. They had not only stolen millions of dollars, but they had done so in a way that ensured their crime would be hidden from public scrutiny indefinitely. Their perfect execution had been matched by perfect concealment, creating a criminal success that was as complete as it was devastating. But in the digital age, even the most carefully buried secrets can be unearthed by the relentless logic of computer algorithms. The same technological advances that had made modern financial crimes more sophisticated had also made old crimes more vulnerable to detection. Database cross-referencing capabilities that did not exist in 1984 would eventually expose connections that human investigators had missed, turning routine administrative procedures into powerful investigative tools. The automated systems that would ultimately expose the community bridge fraud were not designed for criminal investigation. They were created for efficiency, accuracy, and administrative convenience. But their ability to process and cross-reference vast amounts of data would prove to be the downfall of criminals who had believed their crimes were perfectly hidden. The breakthrough came during what should have been a routine weekend maintenance operation. On a Saturday morning in February 2023, IRS Systems Administrator Jennifer Walsh was overseeing the migration of legacy tax data from servers that had been in continuous operation since the late 1990s. The process was mundane, tedious work that involved transferring millions of records from outdated database formats into modern cloud-based systems. As part of the migration, automated verification protocols ran continuous cross-checks between different data sets to ensure information integrity during the transfer process. These protocols were designed to flag discrepancies, duplicate entries, and corrupted files that might compromise the accuracy of tax records. They were not programmed to detect criminal activity. At 3:47 a.m. Pacific Time, one of these automated cross-checks triggered an anomaly alert that appeared in Walsh's monitoring dashboard. The alert indicated a mismatch between employer identification numbers in 2 separate databases, a common occurrence during the large-scale data migrations that typically resolved itself through routine error correction procedures. Walsh initially dismissed the alert as another routine glitch. The error report showed that a nonprofit organization's tax-exempt status had been flagged for inconsistent documentation across multiple years. Such discrepancies were usually caused by clerical errors, database corruption, or changes in organizational status that had been incompletely recorded. But as Walsh attempted to resolve the discrepancy through standard procedures, she discovered something that made her pause. The organization in question, Community Bridge Foundation, showed active tax-exempt status in the IRS database from 1979 through 1987, despite having been legally dissolved in California in 1984. More puzzling still, the foundation appeared to have filed annual tax returns for 3 years after its official dissolution. The post-dissolution tax filings were not elaborate documents. They were simple forms indicating minimal financial activity. the kind of paperwork that might be filed by an organization winding down its operations over an extended period. But the filings contained one detail that caught Walsh's attention. They included employer identification numbers for staff members who had supposedly vanished in 1984. Walsh's curiosity was piqued. She expanded her database search to include Social Security Administration records, immigration databases, and state business registration files. What she discovered was a pattern of activity that suggested the Community Bridge Foundation had not truly ceased operations in 1984, but had instead continued functioning in some capacity for several additional years. The post-dissolution tax filings showed modest but consistent financial activity. Small amounts of money flowed through accounts associated with the foundation's employer identification number, never enough to trigger audit thresholds, but sufficient to maintain the organization's legal existence in federal databases. The pattern suggested that someone had been deliberately keeping the foundation alive on paper long after its public dissolution. Walsh forwarded her findings to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, which assigned the case to Special Agent Robert Chen, a veteran investigator with 2 decades of experience in financial crimes. Chen's initial assessment was that Walsh had uncovered evidence of a tax avoidance scheme, possibly involving an organization that had failed to properly close its affairs after dissolution. But as Chen delved deeper into the records, he realized he was looking at something far more significant. The Community Bridge Foundation was not simply a case of sloppy bookkeeping or minor tax evasion. It was connected to one of the largest nonprofit fraud cases in federal history, a case that had been sealed and classified for nearly 4 decades. Chen requested access to the sealed FBI files from 1984, a process that required multiple levels of approval and took several weeks to complete. When he finally obtained the documents, he understood why the case had been classified. The sophistication of the fraud, the scale of the theft, and the complete disappearance of the perpetrators represented a level of criminal achievement that federal agencies had been reluctant to acknowledge publicly. The sealed files revealed details that had never been shared with other law enforcement agencies or incorporated into training programs for financial crimes investigators. The perpetrators had not simply stolen money and disappeared. They had created a criminal infrastructure that had continued operating for years after their supposed vanishing act. Chen's analysis of the post-dissolution financial records revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been functioning quietly for nearly a decade after the fraud was supposedly discovered. Small amounts of money continued to flow through accounts associated with the Community Bridge Foundation, moving in patterns that suggested ongoing criminal activity rather than legitimate wind-down operations. The money trail led to a network of shell corporations, dummy accounts, and offshore banking facilities that had been established using the same techniques employed in the original fraud. But these newer operations were smaller in scale and more carefully concealed, suggesting that the perpetrators had learned from their earlier near exposure and adapted their methods accordingly. Chen's investigation revealed that the Community Bridge Network had not disbanded in 1984, but had instead evolved into a more sophisticated and cautious criminal enterprise. The dramatic disappearances of Margaret Chen, Thomas Kellerman, and Linda Santos had been carefully staged events designed to convince law enforcement that the network had been destroyed, when in reality it had simply gone deeper underground. The post-1984 operations were managed through a series of legitimate-appearing businesses and nonprofit organizations that were actually fronts for money laundering activities. These operations were smaller and more geographically dispersed than the original Community Bridge Foundation, making them virtually impossible to detect through conventional investigation methods. Chen's findings prompted a comprehensive review of the sealed case files from the 1980s. Federal investigators realized that their assumption about the network's destruction had been incorrect, and that the sophisticated criminal enterprise they had failed to capture in 1984 had been operating continuously for nearly 4 decades. The implications were staggering. If the Community Bridge Network had continued functioning after 1984, it had likely been responsible for additional frauds that had never been detected or connected to the original case. The total amount stolen over the intervening decades could easily have exceeded $100 million, making it one of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history. The automated database crosscheck that had triggered Jennifer Walsh's curiosity had accomplished what decades of human investigation had failed to achieve. It had exposed the continued existence of a criminal network that had successfully hidden in plain sight for nearly 40 years, protected by assumptions, bureaucratic secrecy, and the limitations of pre-digital investigative techniques. The Community Bridge Foundation case was officially reopened in April 2023, nearly 4 decades after it had been sealed and forgotten. The sophisticated fraud that had begun as a theft of federal housing assistance funds had evolved into something far more complex and enduring, demonstrating that even the most carefully buried secrets cannot remain hidden forever in an age of interconnected databases and automated analysis. The perfect crime had finally been exposed by the perfect accident, a routine computer maintenance operation that had stumbled upon evidence that human investigators had never thought to seek. After 39 years of silence, the Community Bridge Foundation was about to give up its secrets, one database entry at a time.